Chapter 7. Back at the hotel, the clock ticked away the last few seconds before midday. It was one of those clocks that could distract from just about anything you were doing. Augustine had never stayed in the hotel and wondered if each bedroom had a clock just like the one he was staring at. It would stop him from sleeping. He had called a meeting for that time for 2 reasons. He wanted the team to have time to do their stuff, and his experience told him that a midday meeting meant hungry stomachs. The meeting would be as long as needed, but as short as possible. People readying themselves for something to eat meant they were succinct, and succinctness was the order of the day. At that point, the whole team were assembled in the corridor outside the room, with the notable exception of Ash, who had messaged to say that he was on the way back, fighting through traffic and would be a couple of minutes late. Augustine had already given him a quick run-through on the phone as he drove, so he could start the meeting at the desired time. Ash was in the loop and would catch up on any new developments discussed in the meeting after. The final tick on the clock. All 3 hands stood upright. "Right, let's get on with this, shall we?" Augustine called into the corridor. The team walked in one by one. Gary, head down, was deep in thought. Either that or whatever game on his iPhone had taken his fancy this month. He had bored everyone silly with Brain Out the month before. It took Gary a few days of deep intensity in a smartphone game before he started to talk about it. Electra walked in with a smile on her face, as usual. She knew that a smile was infectious and made her immediately more likable. She had read studies that likable people got further in life, even to the degree where they got more time with doctors and other medical professionals just because they were likable. She decided to be likable every day of her life. Lou was eager and ready to get on with things. As the eldest member of the team, hunger always seemed to strike him first. He wanted cold, hard facts, then deal with the emotion later. Maybe after they had eaten. Maybe after they had cracked the case. "I think we need to concentrate on what we have found so far. Gary, do you want to run the rest of them through the CCTV? "Sure thing, Boyle." Augustine shivered at the name. It wasn't how he wanted to be referred to. "We have someone, probably male, walking through the corridor at 1:03 a.m. and then back through the same corridor at 1:14 a.m. The CCTV images aren't as good as we would like. That's why I am saying probably male. They have a male build and are pretty tall, but that doesn't rule out the other half of the population yet. There are some pretty blokey-looking women around nowadays." "Thanks for the casual sexism, Gary. Can we stick to the facts as we know them?" Augustine interjected to keep the discussion on track. He could feel this blowing up into a heated conversation between Electra and Gary. Now wasn't the time or the place. Neither would back down. "Note that he is wearing white shoes, not trainers, white shoes. The possible perpetrator was carrying nothing on entry and then a case on exit. We also know that John O'Toole was carrying a case when he checked in, as we found nothing in the room. We're putting 2 and 2 together here, and we're pretty sure that the answer is 4. "Great, thanks, Gary." Augustine spoke, and felt as though he was an MC, introducing speakers and keeping the meeting flowing. "Electra, what do we have?"
"Not a great deal, Gus. The maid walked into the room, saw what we've all seen, and then pretty much ran in the opposite direction. She came back to close the door a few minutes later when she'd regained her composure a little. She didn't want to go back, but also didn't want anyone else to walk in on what she had witnessed. And she's just incredibly upset after that," Electra explained.
"And the same with the manager and 2 receptionists that Gary has spoken to. Right, Gary?" Augustine continued.
"Yep."
"So, Lou, what do you have?" Augustine asked just as Ash walked into the room and silently shuffled into a chair to hear what was going on. He looked dishevelled, and the rest of the team let him settle without saying a word.
"I've spoken to the Holiday Inn and the Premier Inn. No staff member in either of these locations saw anything unusual. It's midweek and they tend to busy themselves getting prepared for the weekend. That means they're not sitting around bored, good for them. But it also means they don't have their eyes and ears on the streets looking for crime. Bad for us. Anyway, the manager at the Holiday Inn had a great idea. We put together a small leaflet asking guests if they saw or heard anything unusual during their stay. Their receptionists will be handing these out as people check out. It might give us a lead or two. Same at the Premier Inn. I've put my number down, so all these will come through to me. They all have CCTV systems too, but much of it is focused internally. The outside cameras have pretty much nothing except for guests coming and going.
Lou explained the total of his morning's work. He was satisfied that he did all he could, but not at all satisfied that he couldn't come back to the room with something concrete to go on. That was his way as he got older. Lou always wanted the world to move more quickly than it did. It wasn't that he was impatient, more that he felt the need for answers. He knew they would come eventually, but worried in some ways that he wouldn't be around when the answers arrived. And that leads nicely on to Ash. "How are you doing, my friend?" Augustine asked as a few chuckles rippled across the room before leaving via the crack under the door. They all knew when Ash was out of sorts. He had no way of hiding it. The discomfort of his morning was written all over his face. "I had the pleasure of—" No, Ash, I didn't ask you to start. I asked how you were. How are you, Ash?" Sniggers rather than chuckles this time. Ash looked at Augustine like he would like to walk out of the room and start again. In fact, Ash thought, it wasn't just the room. He wanted to go back to bed and start the day again. He'd had his sleep broken, felt like the odd one out at the scene of the murder, and then had the pleasure of accidentally interviewing Pierre White when he was looking for the debt collection people. "I'm good, Gus. How are you? Electra, Gary, Lou, how are you all?" Ash asked hurriedly, wanting to get down to business and maybe back to bed. "We're all okay, Ash," Augustine responded on behalf of the team. "Now we all know we're all okay. Can you fill us in on the events of your morning, specifically relating to the investigation that started in this hotel this morning?" Augustine asked in his most formal style. He had no idea why he was speaking like this. It just felt right for the time. "I've bumped into the head of the Campanile Hotel Organisation in the fair city of Gateshead. He was a strange character, that's for sure. It felt like he had loads to hide. Maybe not related to the murder, but he was as evasive as anyone I've ever met, including some of my exes." Ash spoke with some personal humour that lowered his own feeling of tension.
Nobody has officially announced this as a murder yet.
Gary raised an objection. "Well, unless the guy cut out his own eyes and placed them facing himself before he committed suicide, I think we're fairly sure this is a fucking murder, Gary." Ash responded with a return to his tense self. "Can I continue?" he asked rhetorically, before doing just that. "The thing we need to get to the bottom of, as far as I can see, is the passes given out to people who can seemingly just come and go from the hotels across the chain. It allows access at any time. So I've got a list here of the passes given out by head office." Ash pointed to the piece of paper in his hand, thankful that it was only one page. "Head office is given out passes too?" Augustine asked. "We have a similar list of passes given out by the hotel manager. Ken Lazarus is on our list. I'm still sure he is the first port of call. First, let's all grab something to eat. We have a full afternoon ahead of us. Lou and I will go and pay a visit to our friend Lazarus, while Ash, can you check the rest of the names on your list for previous? Then try to pin down the debt collection people. I guess they're busy people at this time of year, a few months after Christmas and all that. Electra and Gary, can you start to pull all of this together in reports? I'm sure Marie will want to see some progress. And you know the deal. If it's not written down, it didn't happen." Food. Gary favoured fast food. Electra and Lou were both on diets, while Augustine and Ash would go with the flow. Gary headed off in his car to the KFC drive-thru at the galleries, hoping to catch a zinger and a chicken sandwich before he got back to work, where he would meet up with Electra and get on with the rest of the day.
Writing reports was never his idea of making a difference, but he was willing to concede that it was essential if they were going to convict after catching the criminals.
"Anyone else fancy grabbing something at the Costa on the gallery's retail park?" Electra asked.
All heads nodded in return, so off they headed in as many cars as they had arrived in. Each was heading off their own way after the food.